In the background there roiled a dark sea, the assembly of the depressed, the persecuted, the suffering. There was no holy mountain in the shadow of which this great assembly gathered. They stood before a void of blackness. They gazed into the void, but without faces and without colour. Grey, cold, and though ranged together in numbers like loosely organised regiments, they were each alone. These prisoners stared at me with the face of a great emptiness, and my soul recoiled before them, as before a horrible enigma. Gilles and I walked through the gates of Drancy together, with the 800 released prisoners, Gilles leaning like a leaden effigy on my arm. Gilles was a walking death. He did not know it. Do the dying ever know it? It was as if the months of our suffering in the camp had blinded us to the severity of our sickness. Dysentery, more or less untreated, is a deadly contagion. I felt this in myself and saw it in others' sunken black eyes. Yet just the night before, in the darkness of my barracks, lying on the straw-strewn floor, I had somehow passed through the worst of that horrible illness. Health is a miracle. Like all miracles, one does not experience its miraculous character, except, first, when it is gone in its horrible absence, and second, when, and if one is lucky enough, to experience its restoration. And then the fragmentary agony of illness becomes the dream, an unreality, a memory. Two short little excerpts there from William Hackett's 2021 novella, Outside the Gates, which was kindly sent to me by Angelico Press, so a big thank you to them. Hackett is writing here under the name W.C. Hackett, but many of you will recognize the name from two discussions that have been on the podcast with William or Chris, one on the philosophy of Stanislas Breton, and the other one on the philosophy and life of Jean Val. And this is what this book is about. It's a theory fiction. It's not solely fictional, but it's a retelling, in Hackett's own words, of a certain fairly small time frame within Jean Val's real life. So for those that don't know, Jean Val was a French philosopher, and he was a Jew interned at the Drancy internment camp, which was northeast of Paris, and then escaped. So this book, interestingly, is about Val's escape, and it begins immediately at that juncture, which is really where the analysis of this book begins. Is that we begin with a literary negation. So, often the trope or the dramatized moment of the opening of the gates, to refer sort of to the title here, Outside the Gates, the opening of the gates, this sort of presupposed catharsis that arrives from escape or exit or leaving the cave in philosophical terms, and in realistic terms, the possible presupposed catharsis of hearing a story of a World War II escapee from an internment camp would, I think, personally would presume emotions of catharsis and joy, and of the opposite of what is afforded to us. And it's in this way that the novella immediately begins to draw Val's philosophy straight into the text, in that in the literary form, transcendence, the beyond, immanence, and change, which are key factors within Val's philosophy, and I would recommend everyone to go listen to the episode on Val after this, are immediately brought in to this first moment. So the first moment is Val and his friend Gilles. I'm probably mispronouncing Alain. I don't know if it's Elaine, but Gilles Alain. So apologies for that mispronunciation. But Val and his friend Gilles are escaping. So we're given the literary peak immediately, and it's negated immediately and sort of thrown back into like the Heraclitean River by the fact of, as soon as they leave, what actually happens is, like, they're outside the gates, they escape. What happens is an acknowledgement of a transformation of forms within the body. So an acknowledgement of that which has been in the background because there has been something sort of greater at stake, and now you're outside the gates, and what happens isn't this catharsis, it's a continuation of the Valian in between. So he's always in between going beyond the human, and so two forms of transcendence as movement, so the way humans reach beyond themselves, and the transcendence as end, that which transcends the human. And so what we see here is two forms of that, in the sense that the end is not given to us, so we actually begin at a presupposed literary end of escape. So we're not afforded anything immediately, so we're thrown into the same existential confusion as Val and Alain, in the sense that nothing is afforded to them that perhaps one would have hoped for. But equally with that comes the transcendence as movement, in the sense that the human subject reached beyond itself, because they're now just immediately within the next stage, which is to do with the fact Gilles is extremely ill, to the point where, like, until they just have to keep going till they get to a point where they can sit down, and he is so ill and tired that he falls asleep under with snow just falling on him under a tree. And so they escape from Drancy, and we're immediately within, like, something which has changed but hasn't changed, which is an in-between. And peaks are constantly negated. There is any ascension is often mirrored with its inherent descension. So, like, any possible, for instance, the novella is peppered tactically with moments wherein there are glorious descriptions of traditional French food, and they're described in such a way as to contrast as a polarity the suffering, dirtiness, illness of the world and of Val and Gilles, who are emphasized as being these sort of extremely ill, extremely dirty people at this time. And it's contrasted with the food. And so none of these moments of existential catharsis, where human beings might be able to anchor themselves as selves and say, this is the position that we are now within as beings, like, we've moved from this now to this, this isn't afforded to us. And so there is a certain sense of, to get sort of philosophical, as it is a philosophical novella, there is a certain sense of Heideggerian time from the start, in the sense that the past is being pushed in front of them. So I'll get to one reason that's happening, and the future is pushing them from behind. So the one reason that the past is always, past isn't behind them in the Heideggerian sense. For the Heideggerian sense, you're always pushing the past in front of you, because what's happened, you are pushing through the memory which is in front of you, and the future pushes you because that's where you're heading towards. So that's actually what's causing the trajectory. And for Hackett, the way Hackett writes it, and for Val, there is a Nazi, I guess, commander and leader of Drancy, internment camp, who is sort of extremely malicious, sort of a natural evil in a way, Theodore Dannecker. And Dannecker is, for Val and Gilles, the past which is in front of them. He is a haunt from the beginning of the novel. He's haunting and underlying all experience is he as a possible attack, a possible basically a literal haunt in which the majority of their movements he is behind the scenes as a possibility, as the negative possibility, which will entail further suffering. He is on them. They existentially they have become within their space that they are allowed until they get to the free zone, which is where they're really heading throughout the novella. He acts as the antagonist that is controlling their movements, is controlling them. And so everything ends up merging into something where there isn't an anchor point and everything just keeps moving. I've got a fair few extracts that I'd like to read because it's extremely well written. In the mirror was a man. Death warmed up, as the soldiers in the trenches say to one another. I did not know this man. He spoke. His words were strange, but they felt, I feel, as if they were a key, and if only I knew where to place the key. But I do not. He spoke in hieroglyphs. What is a dream? He demanded a response. I could not answer, shocked as I was into a deranged silence. The man smiled. This question is impossible to answer, he said, for even if the dreamer knows that he is dreaming, this knowledge, this awakening as it were, is only an element within the dream. It too is illusion, composed wholly of dream material. Even in dreams there is much reality. Reality, one could say, is the very stuff of dreams. Dreams are not reality, and yet reality is all they are. Dreams are the falsehood, one could say, of reality. The man's words were cold and clear, like the depths of water bending tree limbs that fall into them. He continued, To awaken is to pass from sleep to another state. It is to pass from one world to another. Which way does the waking go? Which world is the false pendant of the other? Who can decide between them? The man gazed at me, a mocking look in his eyes. When I opened my eyes to feel the weight of my body pressing me, holding me, riveting me to this heavy, fragile world of struggle and death, of ignorance and endless frenzy and distraction, am I awake? Or does the waking go in the other direction, through the dream, beyond forgetting and the wall of silence, into the dreamless, into what is real? Who can decide between them? And so, in much the same way that Danica is in a way, empirical haunt of Orlan and Val's movement, their impetus towards having to escape at all, this vindictive maliciousness which wants to existentially destroy them simply for something hidden in their nature, in a way. This beginning of, for this is chapter 5, called The Vision. In the mirror was a man. This is a recurrent theme throughout the novella, which internally doesn't necessarily split, but fragments Val's character into an ongoing discussion of reality and unreality, and in that way back to transcendence of movement, going beyond the human, and transcendence as end. So the discussion of who and what it is that is going somewhere, and who and what it is that might be going beyond itself. And in this way, there is a lot of polarity within the novella in the sense of suffering and health, dirtiness and cleanliness, and also self and unself, of trying to hold on to who it is that is eventually going to be there at the end. Once again, that Heideggerian notion of pushing a past self forward with someone else. And there's a section that I'll read out later that gets into this with respect to death. But to continue with the plot, they've escaped. There's scenes of bread and nourishment and of reminders of life, but they are of course drawn into a world which is suddenly acknowledged by both Val and Alan as just being ill. This world is gone, it's ill. And the pains of the body, the reality of the body comes back. The hotel which they eventually end up in is this sort of a cold comfort in a way. The comforts are given to them, but the comforts are only comforts in their polarity against the aches of the body, the hungers, and also the absolute uncertainty and paranoia of the moment. All the while this novel is going on, there is an inherent understanding that nothing is standing still. Everything is merged. Everything is almost to draw on like the atomists, actually. A good way to think about this novella is one of the atomists' understanding of like looking at your hand and realizing that this is quite an abstract way to look at it, but looking at your hand and realizing like that your finger is made up of atoms, but that doesn't mean that the middle section, it doesn't mean there's nothing there. And so all of this is merging in a sense. That is exactly how I felt reading this novella, in that everything is intermingling with everything else, which denies an anchor, denies anything to hold on to, which itself begets more uncertainty, more paranoia, because you as a reader entering into Val's mind have that inherent understanding that there is, what is it that Val is trying to cling to? What is it that he's like managing to hold on to amidst this in between, amidst these polarities where everything's merging, amidst this paranoia, amidst this uncertain future? What is it that he manages to hold on to? And I would actually say that what he manages to hold on to is the notion of not being able to hold on to anything. He holds on to the question of, why does one continue now that has been acknowledged? And he holds on to the not some stereotypical stoic, I go on, I go on because I want to fight something, and also not a Beckettian, I can't go on, I'll go on. It's like a negation of that, into the sense that within the Beckettian, I'll go on, I can't go on, I'll go on, is like this triumph in a way. And I don't think there is a triumph in Val. There is something being carried, and he's interested in the questions of like, what is carrying. So with continuing the plot, with this polarity of, especially the empirical polarity of comfort, disease and illness, there's these subtle hints of trying to escape the body and not being able to do it. It always comes back. And then there is about 3 or 4 different flashbacks, and one to a sort of an ex-student of Val's from years ago, Francois Hung, who he thinks back to in suddenly talking to the student who I believe is originally studying physics. And then because of a chat about value and meaning of thought and the purpose of life, Hung changes what he's studying because of this. And this in itself allows for an entry of this discussion of the meaning of life, the meaning of what, like that itself is a flashback discussion, once again, Heideggerian time of the past being in front of you, drawing that forward as a way to draw in a discussion of why to continue. But for Val, I believe, the questions aren't stereotypically existential of why do humans continue forward. It goes on anyway. And in that way, you find that in between, where the notion of that stereotypical existential notion of the meaning of life, why do we continue on, why do we move forward as human beings, I would argue in the normative sense, if there can be one, is reliant on at least the presumption or the assumption of a teleological moment. So there's that. You see this in Moby Dick, the whale, right? Right, there's the whale, gonna go kill the whale, and like the whale is the moment in time drawing everyone towards it. Val's thought negates that, and it's the question of, and the book negates that. So it's the question of what to do when that will not be. You aren't moving point to point to point. You aren't moving from one river to separate river to separate river to separate river. You're stood in the same river. It's taking Heraclitus at his word amidst suffering and death. So there is this. It's a Valian nomadic novel where nomadism, the points of nomadism, dissipate upon arrival. And then eventually, keep moving. They are a woman, Alice Carbon, comes to help them escape, sort of via revolutionary, French revolutionary means at the time. Val has been proclaimed public enemy, to be shot on sight. And at this point, the Danica suddenly like, oh yeah, Danica, like that's what's been in the background. That is what's upstream. That is what's in this water and keeps sort of tapping against, you could say the legs of Olon and Val, is this notion of a sort of malevolent evil that there is no reasoning with. There's no rationality here that could be utilized to transform this situation into something else. And so it's just movement. It's movement away from that, because there's nothing else that can be done with it. What is to be done with life when the rationality and those anchor points are removed, which are rationality? That's the question. Time keeps passing. Time becomes almost indiscernible at this point, just sleeping in vague hotel rooms, occasionally having to move from place to place, and constantly around strangers who, because of the time, of course, in World War II, where if you were hiding a Jew, I mean, you were going to be killed as well. So it's everyone and everywhere becomes foreign and a stranger. So Val is, of course, go meet this stranger, and they will give you some vague enough that they can't be deciphered by the Nazis, instructions to where to go, and go to this random hotel room with some other strangers that you don't know, and just be fed by random people, and everything is foreign. Even on sort of in France, everything is foreign. Eventually they get some instructions about where to meet, where to go to a car, and also at this point it's key to point out that a lot of where Val is sleeping for a fair amount of the novella is on a psychoanalyst's couch, which is a little sort of nod to the ability of Hackett to allow that when he sort of lays down, that's when suddenly a lot of what would you call it, free talk happens, his philosophical musings on the situation. However, the hotel that they were at, Danica does eventually find them, and he hits Gilles Lalonde while Val is hiding in this impenetrable darkness. Danica hits Gilles Lalonde on the back of the head, kills him, and picks him up and carries him into the night. And this really haunts Val, which I'll get to in a couple of sections. And then eventually, after this scene in the hotel, there's a few more nights sort of in other places, and then Val escapes to the country, into the border, into what's called the Libre zone, free zone. And that's the basics of the novel. Is a negatively nomadic novel, and I don't try to use nomadism in a cheap sense there. I'll read one more section and then just dive a bit more. Actually, I'll read it. Yeah, and then I'll dive deeper into the themes. So I believe these are possible actually quotes from Val, but I'm not sure on that. But it was an incredible section. The buried virtue of your ancients is only uncovered by a cultivated awareness, knowledge of a peculiar kind, knowledge of our essential ignorance, which Socrates called wisdom. This knowledge is reasoned reflection on the state of illusion that is ours in the world, leading to the stunning recognition that the truth, the unfathomable truth, alone really is. The truth that is beyond our labyrinth of circles, unreachable, hidden, but at the same time everywhere, immediate like the light that is too bright to look at, but illumines all things. Everything derives from it, everything points to it, everything hides it. The one in single-hearted pursuit of ignorance, of the acceptance and affirmation of things as they are, the one who accepts the straight fact that the circle of opposites rules over us. This is the one who already begins to escape the labyrinth, to live bodied life in another peculiar way. He awakens to the knowledge, in other words, that he is dreaming. Birth and death derive from one another. Both are within the dream. Both are subject to suffering, to the domination of desire for control, survival, and escape. The body is born, the body survives if chance allows it, the body dies. The self, the soul, is what awakens, but not in the body. The soul awakens when the body sleeps. Sleep is like death, passage into another state. And the body suffers. How it suffers. The body is dream reality. The self, the soul, is not. There is reality, but this dream is not it. There is reality, and it is the source of the dream, the illusion. To awaken, to leave the body in its sleep, is to be released from life, to pass through the gates, to pass from the illusion of life, which is really death, to life, which only appears as death within the dream. The dream self, the body once unlocked and opened, is left behind. It has performed its only real function, to swing open as a gate, and the gate is death, the death of illusion. The dreamer cannot awaken himself. He is awoken by another from the other side, from the waking world. And when he is undergoing the process of awakening, the other appears veiled within the dream, first not even as an alien element, but so well masked that he is not even recognized. But somehow the recognition happens. This is life acknowledging itself through death, reality becoming aware of itself through dream. So there we see from that the notion of polarity, the intermingling and the inability or ability to find amidst that whether or not there is illusion, whether or not there is something which can be held on to. And Wahl, from my memory and understanding of Wahl's philosophy, the notion of holding on, perhaps the notion of grasping, is a turbulent problem for Wahl, because once you have it, it probably enters into that notion of illusion, because you're in a way you're entering into one side of a polarity. And so, if you hold on to suffering, then you're only holding on to one side of polarity, but you're equally only holding on to one side of the transcendent forms that Wahl affords us in his philosophy. So some sort of teleology where you're holding on to that and ignoring that passage of the body as it seeks to retain a function for you as you move forward, as transcendence of movement. So there is an inability and ability both at the same time. There is often a collapsing of polarity into a middle space, a collapsing of dualism possibly, into a middle space which, as we can see amidst Hackett's utilization of form of literary writing, alongside a real moment, a real passage of time within Wahl's life, how that passage of time can be understood in the Wahlian sense as, full of confusion, paranoia, interspersion, and Heraclitean movement, how from that the notion of perhaps a certainty, the notion of the certainty of movement, comes from a question, and not from it doesn't seem from a self. Self has been lost to something, to other forms which are really in control of it at that time. But I'll move through to one final passage and then wrap up. The man changed, staring at me. He had the face now of a child, of the child. In my dream, I tell him, I was an old man, a dying man, and I am telling a story to a little boy in a room of crowded people. Do you understand? I confess I do not. I only understand death in terms of dream. Or is it life that I understand that way? At the story's end, I breathe my last. It is 1974. I am in Paris. It is a bright day, but its colours, its life are dull and distant. A warm wind is blowing through the open window of my apartment. Among the people assembled before me are 3 beautiful young women, my daughters, and a 4th, still vibrant, still beautiful, my wife, decades younger than myself. They are all listening to me. They think my mind is gone, but it is not true. There is also another presence in the crowded room, little, vital and quiet, imperceptible except to those with eyes grown dim to this world, those with eyes that open for the first time and as if newly born to the hidden world. This presence stands by a dying man's awkwardly turned head and holds his aged hand. I know I am the old man in the dream, but I am also watching from above. The old man speaks to this little spark of light, this warmth, this tiny epochal truth, as if, together, they were on quite familiar terms. In fact, we had spoken. I felt this. Now I feel this. Many times. Perhaps we spoke in the countless dreams I've forgotten when, following the birth of a morning sun, I crossed the threshold into waking life, day after day. Perhaps the content of these honoric encounters is simply too weighty, too ponderous to contain in this waking world, as if one were try to place a mountain inside of a skull. What about the entire range of mountains of which that little mountain is only a tiny fragment? What about the massive, variegated crust of the earth, with its heights and depths, its diverse range of geographical climatic differences, searing heat, burning cold, darkness and light, and the sun system, the galaxy, the universe of which such a large mountain is incomprehensibly far, far less than the slightest perceptible point? I was fathoming these things, gazing into his face, whether, like daylight, I recognized something in its features. We, the boy and I, are on familiar, one could say familial terms. Continued speaking, enchanted by the words, by the realities into which they bled. The story that is told, as I lay dying, is an ending of sort. Consider it a bedtime story told by a father to a son. I suggest to the boy, but here, I say, here in the dream, it is the old man who peacefully falls asleep at the end. The little boy whom only I can see laughs. We are no longer in the train car. We are in the words of my story, my apartment, my deathbed, surrounded by faces and wind and light. The boy laughs. When he laughs, it is almost as if the beloved family and dear friends, faces that I knew, faces that I did not know, but they were all dear to me. The dear ones of a worldly man, along with the room, the busy city outside, the spinning world, the sun and stars, all fade into a soft grey, a cherished memory, but a memory nonetheless. But as they fade, and before each of my deathbed visitors silently, mournfully departs to return to his or her ordinary concerns, each one there listens to this whispered story. The story I'm telling, the story of a dying, delirious man, with rapt attention, without moving, almost without breathing. So that ending, well, it's not actually the ending, there's a fair bit to go after that, but it's what's odd is endings, beginnings, middles. It's not like that. You have the Heideggerian time, but you also have what I would be reminded of Poincare's maps. Take a map, draw lines on it, write dates in chronological order of it. Take someone's life, draw it on a handkerchief, dates in chronological order as a grid, and then screw up the handkerchief, fold it. All these points begin to meet, all the possible peaks, transcendences, aboves, belows, sideways, all the referential moments of a person's life, and therein death, and their sufferings, and their pleasures, and all the polarities, seeming polarities of linear time, and of dualisms. You fold it all up together, they begin to intermingle and intersperse, and in that way the novel becomes non-linear, because the flashbacks seamlessly enter in, the jumps to a death enter in that way, and so the novel is a non-linear, nomadically Valian novel or novella. That's my thoughts on Hackett's Outside the Gates. I think it's actually a really great entry to Jean Val's philosophy is quite intuitive to understand. It's quite tough to understand because of this intermingling. It's a really great entry to understand his philosophy in an existential, internal sense. So if you were to get into Val, I think this is genuinely a great place to start, to see both a little bit of Val's life, a little bit of how his biography influences his philosophy, how that would happen, and also just a great novel. So that is Outside the Gates by W.C. Hackett, William Hackett, and I'll put links for our other discussions in the description below, and also a link for where you can get the book. Once again, thanks to Angelico Press for sending it. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed my chat on Outside the Gates.